Every empire convinces itself that it has created a new form of money, something smarter, more refined, more advanced than whatever came before, and every empire, sooner or later, is forced to confront the same unpleasant truth. It didn't. The patterns repeat. The tools change shape, the technology evolves, the language is updated for the era. But underneath all of that, money keeps obeying the same set of rules. These are not friendly rules. They're not flexible. They do not bend for ideology or patriotism or speeches about stability and prosperity. They are rooted in behavior, in power, in survival, and they keep showing up throughout history whether rulers like it or not. These rules don't sit in constitutions, and nobody bothered to teach them in school. They were discovered by people who lived through breakdowns, then ignored once the crisis passed, and then discovered again when the next disaster hit. The cycle repeats generation after generation. If you never learn these rules, the financial world will always feel like a rigged casino that you're somehow losing even while you're doing what you're told. That's not a coincidence. It's design. What we're going to do now is uncover those underlying laws of money, the laws that keep resurfacing whether you're looking at ancient Rome or a modern central bank balance sheet. You'll see how coins with shaved silver, paper bills and wheelbarrows, and keystrokes from monetary authorities are all just different costumes for the same story. And you'll understand why the game was never set up to be fair in the first place. We begin with the most blunt, unforgiving law of them all, Gresham's Law. In the 1500s, a man named Sir Thomas Gresham explained a principle to Queen Elizabeth I that would outlive both of them. Bad money drives out good. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a predictable mechanism. The idea works like this. If two types of currency are allowed to circulate side by side, one respected, one degraded, people won't treat them equally. They'll act rationally. They'll get rid of the weaker money and squirrel away the stronger money. They'll spend what's been corrupted and protect what's still trusted. A clean historical example is Rome. The Roman denarius started out as a silver coin with real substance behind it. Over time, as the empire's costs rose, that coin was quietly tampered with. The silver content was diluted. More and more base metal was slipped in. On the surface, the coin still looked official, but citizens could see and feel what was happening. They weren't naive. They didn't hold a debased coin and call it equal. They used the watered-down coins, the ones with less silver, to pay taxes, settle debts, and meet obligations. Meanwhile, the older, heavier coins with higher silver purity quietly disappeared from daily trade and moved into hiding, tucked away, hoarded, preserved. The same thing showed up across medieval Europe. Whenever kings shaved, clipped, or otherwise tampered with coinage, or when they quietly swapped a gold-based currency for cheaper metal, like copper, people adapted instantly. Daily behavior changed. Nobody needed an economics lecture. They just understood, at gut level, that the state was weakening the money, and they reacted to protect themselves. And that reaction has a consequence. Once the population starts dumping the bad money onto the market and pulling the good money out of sight, you set off a spiral. Circulating currency becomes progressively worse in quality. Trust erodes. Prices and contracts stop meaning what they used to mean. Faith in the money system begins to fray, inch by inch. That erosion of trust is not some abstract problem. It is the early stage of monetary decay. That is Gresham's Law. When leaders try to cheat the currency, the public responds by hoarding what's real and pushing the junk back into circulation. And that behavior quietly sabotages confidence in the entire system. But there is another law, and it acts like the darker mirror image of the first one. If Gresham's Law explains what happens in slow decline, this next one explains what happens at the edge of the cliff. It's called Thiers Law, named after Adolphe Thiers, a 19th century French statesman. Thiers' insight was that in periods of extreme breakdown, the normal pattern flips. In those moments, it's not bad money drives out good. It becomes good money drives out bad. That sounds like a contradiction until you understand the setting. Picture the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Prices weren't drifting upward, they were exploding upward. You could watch the value of the currency dissolve between morning and evening. Banknotes that once mattered were turning into scrap in real time. People pushed entire stacks of printed marks in carts just to afford basic food. In that environment, nobody wanted to sit on the local currency any longer than they had to. Holding it was financial self-harm, so people dumped it as quickly as possible. They converted it into anything sturdier: US dollars, gold, cigarettes, direct barter for goods, whatever still held recognizable value. The same basic pattern reappeared in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, and in other episodes of true monetary collapse. Once trust breaks completely, people don't merely hoard the good money and spend the bad. They abandon the bad altogether. They exit the failing currency, and they run toward anything that can still function as a store of value. That is the moment Thiers Law describes, the point where citizens stop believing the promise of the state's money at all and move into parallel money, informal money, hard money. Gresham's law captures the drawn-out rot, the gradual spoiling of money as it's quietly watered down. Thiers Law describes the instant of death, the point where the currency is no longer considered money by the population that's supposed to accept it. So, if Gresham's law is the slow-motion weakening and Thiers' law is the final break, what happens in the long middle ground? The period where the system still functions on paper, salaries still get paid in the national currency, grocery stores still accept it, but regular people can feel that something is off. That uneasy middle is where the Cantillon Effect lives. And the Cantillon Effect shows why inflation doesn't just feel unfair. It is unfair. In the early 18th century, the economist Richard Cantillon noticed a pattern that still explains modern monetary policy. When new money is created and pushed into the economy, it doesn't arrive evenly. It doesn't fall from the sky on everyone at once. It enters through specific channels. It arrives first in the hands of those closest to the source: governments, major financial institutions, connected elites. Those early receivers get to spend that new money immediately, before prices have fully adjusted. They're buying assets, property, goods, services at yesterday's prices. By the time that money filters outward to ordinary workers, savers, and wage earners, the landscape has already shifted. Prices are now higher. The cost of living has jumped. The late receivers of the money aren't benefiting. They're paying. This is not theory. After the financial crisis of 2008, central banks responded with huge programs to inject liquidity and stabilize markets. That wave of money flowed into financial assets first. Stock markets recovered and then surged. Corporate balance sheets healed. Meanwhile, wages for ordinary workers lagged. The headline story said recovery, but the lived reality for a lot of people was stagnation. The same dynamic reappeared in the era of stimulus and money creation from 2020 to 2021. People received checks, yes, but that new money, combined with supply disruptions and policy choices, fed directly into higher prices for essentials, especially housing and food. Grocery bills climbed, rents and home prices spiked. By the time most households actually saw cash in their accounts, the purchasing power of that cash was already being drained. The Cantillon Effect is a quiet transfer mechanism. It directs new wealth upward, toward those closest to monetary power, and hands the bill to everyone else through higher costs. Inflation, in this view, is not just prices going up. It is a pipeline that moves value from late receivers to early receivers. It is a skimming process, and it is baked into how modern money is issued. The cruel part is that this setup isn't treated as corruption. It's treated as policy. People doing everything right, working, saving, trusting the system, feel themselves getting poorer in real terms, but they can't point to a single person breaking into their account. The mechanism is hidden, and that leads to the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Cantillon Effect. The wealthy don't simply end up with more money because they're successful in the traditional sense. They literally get access to money sooner, under better terms, and with less damage from the inflation that arrives later. If the Cantillon Effect reveals why new money travels upward, then the strategy known as financial repression shows how governments make sure the average person can't easily escape downward pressure once it's in place. The phrase financial repression was used after World War II, when many countries emerged with crushing levels of debt and no painless way to get rid of it. Leaders faced a problem. Raising taxes aggressively risked unrest. Refusing to pay, outright default, would destroy credibility and access to future borrowing. So, they engineered a quieter solution, one that didn't look like open theft, but operated like it. The method had a few main components. First, central banks held interest rates artificially low, on purpose. In many cases, rates were kept below the actual rate of inflation. That guaranteed something very specific. If you were an ordinary saver keeping money in the bank, you were mathematically certain to lose purchasing power every single year. Your nominal balance might have stayed the same or inched upward, but what that balance could actually buy in the real world was shrinking. At the same time, governments used rules and capital controls to box people in. Moving money abroad, accessing alternative stores of value, or investing freely outside the approved channels was made difficult or even restricted. The net effect was a cage. Households were kept inside a controlled financial environment where their savings were slowly eroded, while governments benefited. As inflation quietly ate away at the real value of outstanding debt, those massive national obligations became easier to carry. In other words, instead of openly taxing citizens to pay down debts, the system bled citizen savings over time to dissolve those debts in the background. It was a stealth tax that didn't show up as a line item. That same playbook didn't vanish. It resurfaced in updated form. After the 2008 crash, interest rates dropped toward zero and then sat there for years. Anyone trying to be responsible, anyone who parked money in a savings account or a conservative instrument, lost ground in real terms. Meanwhile, people who already owned assets, stocks, real estate, watched those assets inflate in value. Then, in the period from 2020 to 2021, rates collapsed again, massive liquidity was pumped into the system, and everyday living costs jumped hard. Food got more expensive. Housing lurched upward. The purchasing power of savings withered. None of this was accidental drift. It was financial repression adapted to current tools, and the elegance of it, from the point of view of a heavily indebted government, is obvious. Most citizens never identified it as an intentional strategy. They only registered the outcome. They felt poorer. They felt squeezed. They couldn't explain why. Up to this point, we've been looking at how these laws operate at the level of individuals, households, and domestic economies. But some of these laws scale up far beyond that. Some of them shape the fate of entire empires. That takes us directly to Triffin's paradox, also called the reserve currency trap. During the 1960s, economist Robert Triffin testified before the United States Congress about a structural flaw at the center of the global monetary order under Bretton Woods. His argument was simple and devastating. If the U.S. dollar was going to serve as the world's reserve currency, then the United States would have to supply the world with dollars. Global trade, global finance, international settlements, all of that would depend on a constant availability of dollars outside U.S. borders. But there was a catch. The way to spread dollars around the world was for the U.S. to run trade deficits, to buy more from other countries than it sold back, to send dollars abroad in exchange for foreign goods and services. In the short run, this arrangement looked brilliant. The dollar was trusted. The system felt stable. International commerce thrived because everyone was transacting in a currency they believed in. Over the long run, though, Triffin warned that the exact same mechanism would sow instability. The more dollars that flowed overseas, the weaker the dollar's direct link to gold would become. Confidence in the promise, the idea that dollars could ultimately be redeemed for real metal, would erode. Eventually, other nations would question whether the U.S. could actually honor the structure it had built. That pressure climaxed in 1971, when President Richard Nixon cut the tie between the dollar and gold. From that moment on, the dollar was no longer backed by a fixed gold standard. It became fiat money, value sustained by decree and by trust in U.S. power. Since then, the United States has routinely run trade deficits. The country has continued to send dollars out into the world in exchange for physical goods made elsewhere. The domestic result has been predictable. Manufacturing hollowed out. Debt climbed. The financial sector remained elevated and influential because the dollar's special status kept demand for dollar-denominated assets extremely high. The paradox, which Triffin identified decades ago, is brutal. To keep the dollar on the throne as the global reserve, America has to bleed in certain ways at home. It has to tolerate persistent imbalances. It has to consume more than it produces. It has to keep exporting paper claims while importing real output. In doing that, it supports a powerful financial system and maintains geopolitical leverage. but it also undercuts parts of its own internal economy. And now that trade-off is showing stress. Other powers, including players like China, Russia, and coalitions such as the BRICS group, are exploring alternatives and backup arrangements. Central banks around the world have been accumulating gold reserves at a pace not seen in roughly half a century. The message is not subtle. Confidence in a single unchallenged reserve currency is being questioned. The structure that gave the United States enormous reach also carries within it the conditions for slow erosion. That is Triffin's paradox in full. The reserve currency status is both the crown and the poison chalice. If Triffin's paradox exposes how the global monetary order locks itself into a self-defeating loop, then Goodhart's law shows how attempts to steer that order tend to make reality worse, not better. In the 1970s, economist Charles Goodhart articulated an observation that sits like a warning label on modern economic policy. When a measurement becomes a target, it stops being a reliable measurement. Policymakers adore numbers. They trust numbers because numbers look objective. Inflation at 2%. Unemployment at some acceptable single-digit level. Gross domestic product growth ticking along at a politically comfortable pace. These figures are supposed to describe what's happening. They're meant to be dashboards. But the moment political institutions decide that a particular number must land in a particular range no matter what, the game changes. The number is no longer just a reading. It becomes the objective. And when a reading becomes the objective, people start manipulating the system to hit the reading, instead of using the reading to understand the system. Think about inflation targeting. Central banks proclaimed that keeping inflation around roughly 2% would equal stability. That number became sacred. To chase it, they tweaked interest rates again and again. They injected liquidity. They nudged markets. On the surface, the official inflation number appeared tame and controlled. On paper, mission accomplished. But real life did not match the headline. The cost of essential pillars of ordinary existence, housing, healthcare, education, climbed faster and heavier than the sanitized inflation figure suggested. So, the success of hitting the 2% target masked deep distortion. Asset bubbles inflated, debt loads rose, and living costs quietly outran paychecks. Or, take GDP, which politicians and commentators present as the scoreboard of national health. Once grow GDP itself became the prize, governments leaned into whatever would boost that figure in the short term. That included piling on debt, outsourcing industrial capacity, and inflating speculative booms, anything that would keep the number moving upward and prevent the appearance of stagnation. The end result is a surface narrative of prosperity alongside an underlying fragility. Goodhart's law exposes that trap with painful clarity. When leaders obsess over hitting a metric, they stop observing reality honestly. They sculpt the data instead. The measure gets gamed and the truth gets buried. Finally, we arrive at the last law in this progression, the law of diminishing returns on debt. This law doesn't come from some ancient philosopher or a royal advisor whispering to a monarch. It's not wrapped in centuries-old Latin. It's just the math we live under now. Early on, borrowing works. A society can take on debt to build, to expand, to push growth forward. In those early stages, taking on $1 of debt might generate more than $1 of economic output. Debt looks like fuel, but debt is not limitless fuel. Over time, as the total debt load climbs higher and higher, the efficiency drops. The output you get per new dollar of debt shrinks. You borrow $1 and you only get 50 cents of real expansion, then a quarter, then less. Eventually, you hit the point where the debt keeps stacking up, but genuine productive growth stalls. At that stage, the system is no longer using debt to power forward movement. It's using debt just to keep from collapsing. The machine is no longer accelerating. It's straining under its own weight. That's where we are now. The United States is carrying federal debt that's well into the tens of trillions of dollars. Each new round of borrowing is producing less real, broad-based prosperity and more financial engineering. New debt props up markets. New debt services promises. New debt keeps programs alive and stabilizes appearances. But it is not generating matching real wealth for the society as a whole. The underlying arithmetic refuses to lie. Debt saturation is where every dominant power eventually finds itself. When expansion slows, Rome resorted to debasing its coinage. In pre-revolutionary France, The monarchy leaned on borrowing until the strain became unbearable in the years leading up to 1789. The British Empire carried staggering debt burdens after fighting 2 world wars, and that burden bent its global reach. Now, the United States is confronting the same structural wall, the recognition that debt can postpone reckoning, but it cannot erase it. The law is merciless in its conclusion. Borrowing can extend the timeline. Borrowing can delay the consequences. Borrowing can buy breathing room, but borrowing cannot provide an exit from the basic limits of the system. When you step back and line up all of these laws together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Money is not mystical. It's not a generous invention designed to lift everyone together. It behaves according to rules that act like physical forces. One rule tells you that once money is corrupted, ordinary people instinctively shove the weak version into circulation and hide the strong version until confidence erodes. Another rule tells you that, in true crisis, people stop pretending altogether and stampede into anything that still holds value, abandoning the state's currency in practice even if it's still legal tender on paper. Another rule shows that the path new money takes through the economy always privileges those closest to its creation. They get to buy assets early, at favorable prices, while everyone else receives weakened money later and pays higher costs. Another rule shows that governments, when trapped under impossible debt, can quietly lock citizens inside a financial cage, hold interest rates below inflation, and let savings wither in order to melt the debt pile without announcing a default. Another rule explains that when a nation's currency sits at the center of global trade, that nation gains extraordinary leverage, but only by slowly undermining parts of its own internal economy. Another rule warns that once leaders start treating economic statistics as goals rather than instruments of measurement, those statistics cease to reflect reality and start disguising it. And another rule demonstrates that debt eventually stops acting like productive fuel and starts acting like ballast, dragging the system down, even as officials keep insisting that more borrowing is the answer. These are not isolated curiosities pulled from obscure textbooks. They are the operating code of the financial world. They reveal why prices at the store climb faster than your paycheck. They reveal why wage earners feel permanently behind even during so-called booms. They reveal why mortgages grow heavier while financial markets hit new highs. They reveal why entire nations can ride waves of trust, credit, and reserve currency privilege for decades, and then confront the bill when confidence finally weakens. None of this is random. This is the recurring rhythm of monetary history repeating itself with new labels. Here is the part most people are never told outright. The structure was not designed with your protection at the center. It is designed to protect itself. Ordinary participants in the system operate under constant visibility. You report income. You document payments. You pay what you owe when you're told to pay it. Meanwhile, those positioned near the levers of money operate under a different set of conditions. They benefit from timing. They move assets across jurisdictions. They receive liquidity first. You hold cash that quietly loses purchasing power month after month. They hold assets that tend to be inflated upward by the very same policies that quietly drain you. You live with rules. They live with exceptions. The system follows its own hard laws, and unless you take the time to understand those laws, you are effectively playing blind in a game that has already been mapped in advance. History isn't looping in perfect circles, event for event, but money keeps obeying the same core laws. If you don't learn them, those laws will keep grinding you down just the same. If this perspective shifted the way you see the financial world, subscribe. History contains the clues. The path forward is in understanding where to look.